Margaret Thompson never wanted a dog. At 72, she felt too old to start caring for a pet. Her small house in the quiet neighborhood of Maplewood seemed too peaceful to disturb with barking and running around. But life had other plans for her. It was a cold Tuesday morning in November when she found the puppy. The tiny golden retriever mix was shivering behind her garbage cans, no bigger than her shoe. His fur was dirty and matted, and his brown eyes looked up at her with such sadness that Margaret's heart broke immediately. She looked around the street hoping to see someone searching for their lost pet, but the morning was empty and silent. "Well, what am I supposed to do with you?" she whispered, bending down slowly. Her knees creaked as she reached toward the puppy. He didn't run away. Instead, he moved closer to her hand, seeking warmth and comfort. Margaret had lived alone for 8 years since her husband Robert passed away. Her 2 children lived in different states, visiting only during holidays. The house felt too big and too quiet most days. She filled her time with gardening, reading, and volunteering at the local library, but the evenings were the hardest. That's when the loneliness crept in like fog through her windows. She picked up the puppy carefully, surprised by how light he felt in her arms. He snuggled against her sweater immediately, and she felt his little heart beating fast against her chest. "I suppose you need some food and a warm bath," she said, though she was talking more to herself than to him. Inside her kitchen, Margaret found an old bowl and filled it with warm milk. The puppy drank eagerly, his tiny tail wagging for the first time since she'd found him. While he ate, she called the local animal shelter and veterinarian's office to report finding him, but no one had called about a missing golden retriever puppy. "He's probably about 3 months old," Dr. Hayes told her when she brought the puppy in for a checkup the next day. "Healthy, just needs some good food and love. Someone probably abandoned him. Happens more than we'd like to admit." Margaret had planned to surrender the puppy to the shelter after the vet visit, but something stopped her. Maybe it was the way he had slept curled up on her couch the night before, or how he followed her from room to room like a tiny shadow, or perhaps it was how the house didn't feel quite so empty with him there. "I guess I need to give you a name," she said, sitting on her couch with the puppy in her lap. He looked up at her with those intelligent brown eyes, and she remembered her late husband's favorite movie character. "How about Charlie? Charlie Brown was always a fighter, just like you." Charlie seemed to approve. His tail wagged and he licked her hand gently. From that moment, Margaret knew she wasn't giving him up. The first few weeks were challenging. Charlie was house training, which meant accidents on her hardwood floors. He chewed her favorite slippers and knocked over a plant in his excitement to explore, but he also brought something Margaret hadn't realized she was missing: purpose and companionship. Charlie learned quickly. He understood when Margaret said sit and stay. He walked nicely on his leash during their morning trips around the neighborhood. Most importantly, he seemed to understand Margaret's moods. When she felt sad or tired, Charlie would rest his head on her feet or bring her his favorite toy, a squeaky duck she'd bought him. Margaret's neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, noticed the change immediately. "You seem different, Margaret," she said one afternoon as they watched Charlie play in the backyard. Happier, it was true. Margaret found herself smiling more, laughing at Charlie's playful antics. She started taking longer walks, exploring parts of the neighborhood she hadn't seen in years. Charlie made her more social, too. Other dog owners stopped to chat during their walks, and soon Margaret had made several new friends. The bond between Margaret and Charlie grew stronger each day. Charlie learned Margaret's routine perfectly. He knew she woke up at 6:30 and would wait patiently by her bed until she stirred. He understood that Tuesday was grocery day and Thursday was library volunteer day. Most amazingly, he seemed to sense when Margaret missed her late husband most. On the anniversary of Robert's death, Margaret sat in her living room, looking through old photo albums. Tears rolled down her cheeks as she remembered their 50 years together. Charlie, who had been playing with his toys, suddenly stopped and walked over to her. He climbed onto the couch and lay down with his head in her lap, staying perfectly still while she cried. "You understand, don't you, boy?" she whispered, stroking his soft fur. Charlie looked up at her with those wise brown eyes, and Margaret felt less alone than she had in years. As months passed, Charlie grew from a small puppy into a beautiful, medium-sized dog. His golden coat became thick and shiny, and his personality blossomed. He was gentle with children who wanted to pet him during walks, protective when strangers approached Margaret's house, and always eager to please. Margaret started taking Charlie to the library during her volunteer hours. The children's reading program loved having a therapy dog present, even though Charlie wasn't officially trained for it. He would lie quietly while kids read stories aloud, occasionally lifting his head to encourage a nervous reader. "Charlie's better than most humans," Margaret often joked with her librarian friends, but there was truth in her words. Charlie never judged her for crying, never complained when she wanted to stay home and read instead of going out, and never made her feel like a burden. Their evening routine became sacred. After dinner, Margaret would settle into her favorite armchair with a book, and Charlie would curl up on the rug beside her. Sometimes she would read aloud to him, and he would listen attentively as if he understood every word. Margaret's children noticed the change during their holiday visits. "Mom seems so much better," her daughter Sarah whispered to her brother during Christmas dinner. They watched Margaret laugh as Charlie performed his newest trick, rolling over for a treat. "That dog saved her," her son Michael replied. He wasn't exaggerating. Margaret had found new life and purpose in caring for Charlie, and Charlie had found the loving home he'd never had. 2 years after finding Charlie behind her garbage cans, Margaret couldn't imagine life without him. He wasn't just her pet. He was her companion, her confidant, her family. When people asked about her dog, she would always say the same thing. "Charlie didn't rescue me. We rescued each other." Little did Margaret know that their bond would soon be tested in ways she never imagined, and that Charlie's loyalty would become a testament to the deep love between a woman and her dog that would touch the hearts of everyone who witnessed it. 3 years had passed since Charlie entered Margaret's life, and their daily routine had become as natural as breathing. Every morning at 6:30, Charlie would gently nudge Margaret awake with his cold nose against her hand. She would smile, stretch, and whisper, "Good morning, my sweet boy," before getting up to start their day. But on a particularly warm Tuesday in June, something felt different. Margaret woke up feeling dizzy and slightly nauseous. She sat on the edge of her bed for a moment, waiting for the feeling to pass. Charlie sensed something was wrong immediately. Instead of his usual excited morning energy, he stayed close by her side, his brown eyes filled with concern. "I'm okay, Charlie," Margaret said, though her voice sounded weaker than usual, just a little under the weather. During their morning walk, Margaret had to stop and rest twice. She blamed it on the unusual heat, but Charlie knew better. He stayed closer to her than normal, occasionally looking up at her face as if checking to make sure she was all right. When they returned home, Margaret was more tired than she should have been from their short walk around the block. The next few days brought more concerning signs. Margaret's appetite decreased, and she found herself getting winded from simple tasks like carrying groceries or climbing the stairs to her bedroom. Charlie became increasingly protective, rarely leaving her side even to play in the backyard he loved so much. Margaret's daughter Sarah called that weekend for their usual Sunday conversation. "You sound tired, Mom," Sarah said from her home in California. "Are you feeling okay?" "Just a bit run down," Margaret replied, not wanting to worry her daughter. "Charlie and I have been taking longer walks lately. Maybe I'm overdoing it." But Margaret knew deep down that something wasn't right. She had always been active and energetic for her age. The fatigue she was experiencing felt different, heavier somehow. Charlie seemed to understand this too. He started bringing her his toys more frequently, as if trying to cheer her up, and he would rest his head on her lap whenever she sat down. 2 weeks later, during what should have been a routine trip to the grocery store, Margaret felt a sharp pain in her chest. She was standing in the cereal aisle when suddenly she couldn't catch her breath. Charlie, who had been waiting patiently in the car, somehow sensed her distress. When Margaret finally made it back to the parking lot 20 minutes later, moving slowly and breathing heavily, Charlie was whining and pacing in the back seat. "I'm sorry, boy," she said, her voice shaky as she got into the driver's seat. "We need to go see Dr. Martinez." Dr. Martinez had been Margaret's physician for over 15 years. He knew her well enough to recognize that she wasn't someone who complained about minor aches and pains. When she described her symptoms, his expression grew serious. "Margaret, I want to run some tests," he said gently. "The chest pain and shortness of breath could be several things, but we need to find out what's causing them." The blood tests and EKG came back within a few days, but Dr. Martinez wanted more information. "I'm scheduling you for some additional tests at the hospital," he told her during a follow-up appointment. I want to be thorough. Margaret felt scared for the first time since Robert's death. She had faced many challenges in her 75 years, but the possibility of serious illness frightened her more than she expected. That night, she sat in her favorite armchair with Charlie beside her, stroking his fur as she tried to calm her racing thoughts. "What would happen to you if something happened to me?" she whispered to Charlie. The thought of leaving him alone was almost unbearable. Charlie seemed to sense her distress and moved closer, placing his head on her knee and looking up at her with those understanding brown eyes. The hospital tests took most of a Thursday morning. Margaret had arranged for her neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, to check on Charlie, but she worried about him all morning. Charlie had never been alone for more than a few hours, and she knew he would be anxious without her. When Margaret returned home that afternoon, Charlie was waiting by the front door. He greeted her with more enthusiasm than usual, jumping up gently and whining with relief. It was as if he had known she might not come back. Dr. Martinez called with the test results the following Monday. Margaret was in her garden with Charlie when the phone rang. She had been trying to keep busy, but her hands shook slightly as she answered. "Margaret, I need you to come in to discuss the results," Dr. Martinez said. His tone was carefully neutral, but Margaret had heard that tone before. It was the same tone doctors had used when discussing Robert's cancer diagnosis 8 years earlier. "Is it serious?" she asked quietly, watching Charlie dig happily in the flower bed. "We should talk in person," the doctor replied. "Can you come in tomorrow afternoon?" That night, Margaret couldn't sleep. She lay in bed with Charlie curled up beside her, something he rarely did but seemed to know she needed. She thought about all the things she hadn't done yet, all the places she and Charlie hadn't explored together. But mostly, she worried about what would happen to Charlie if her worst fears were confirmed. Charlie seemed to understand that something big was happening. Over the next few days, he became even more attentive than usual. He followed Margaret everywhere, even waiting outside the bathroom door. When she sat down to rest, which she was doing more frequently, Charlie would immediately settle beside her chair. Margaret's son Michael noticed the change during a surprise visit that weekend. "Charlie seems different," he observed, watching as the dog stayed glued to Margaret's side instead of greeting him with his usual excitement. "Dogs know things," Margaret said simply. "Charlie's always been sensitive to my moods." But it was more than sensitivity to moods, and Margaret knew it. Charlie was acting like a dog who sensed his owner was in danger. He had become her constant guardian, watching over her with an intensity that was both comforting and heartbreaking. The night before her doctor's appointment, Margaret sat on her couch with Charlie's head in her lap. She made a decision that brought her both peace and sadness. If the news was as bad as she feared, she would fight as hard as she could, not just for herself, but for Charlie. He deserved to have her around as long as possible. "Whatever happens, sweet boy," she whispered to Charlie, "I promise I won't leave you alone. We'll face whatever comes together." Charlie looked up at her with those wise brown eyes and gently licked her hand, as if sealing a promise between them. Neither of them knew that this promise would soon be tested in ways that would reveal the true depth of their extraordinary bond. Margaret sat in Dr. Martinez's office, her hands folded tightly in her lap as she waited for him to speak. The familiar smell of antiseptic and the sound of the air conditioning humming seemed louder than usual. Charlie was at home, probably pacing by the front door, wondering when she would return. Dr. Martinez closed the file in front of him and looked at Margaret with kind but serious eyes. She had known him long enough to read his expressions, and what she saw there made her heart sink. "Margaret, the tests show that you have advanced heart disease," he said gently. "Your heart muscle has weakened significantly, and the arteries are severely blocked. I'm afraid the condition is quite serious." The words seemed to echo in the small office. Margaret had prepared herself for bad news, but hearing it out loud still felt like a physical blow. She thought immediately of Charlie waiting at home, trusting that she would always come back to him. "How long?" she asked quietly, her voice steadier than she felt. Dr. Martinez leaned forward in his chair. "It's difficult to say exactly. With treatment, we might be able to slow the progression. But Margaret, we're looking at months rather than years, maybe 6 to 8 months, possibly less." Margaret nodded slowly, processing the information. She had lived a long life, longer than many people were blessed to have. But the thought of leaving Charlie behind made her chest tighten with something that had nothing to do with her heart condition. "What kind of treatment?" she asked. We can try medication to help your heart function better and reduce some symptoms. There are also some procedures we could consider, but honestly, at this stage they would only buy you a little time and might make you feel worse. Margaret thought about this carefully. She had watched Robert go through aggressive cancer treatments that made his final months miserable. He had spent more time in hospitals than at home, weak and sick from chemotherapy that ultimately couldn't save him. "I want to go home," she said finally. "I want to spend whatever time I have left with Charlie in my own house." Dr. Martinez nodded with understanding. "I think that's a wise choice. We'll focus on keeping you comfortable and managing your symptoms. I'll arrange for a home health nurse to check on you regularly." On the drive home, Margaret gripped the steering wheel tightly, trying to focus on the road through tears she didn't want to shed. When she pulled into her driveway, she could see Charlie's face in the front window, his tail wagging with relief at her return. The moment she opened the front door, Charlie was there, greeting her with his usual enthusiasm but also something more. He sniffed her carefully as if he could smell the sadness and fear she was carrying. Then he did something unusual. He sat down in front of her and placed his paw on her leg, looking directly into her eyes. "You know, don't you?" Margaret whispered, kneeling down to his level. "You always know." That evening, Margaret called her children. The conversations were difficult, filled with tears and questions she couldn't answer. Sarah wanted to fly out immediately, but Margaret convinced her to wait until she needed more help. Michael offered to move back home, but Margaret knew he had his own family to think about. "I'm not ready to be an invalid yet," she told them both. "Charlie and I still have some good time left together." Over the next few weeks, Margaret made important decisions about her remaining time. She met with a lawyer to update her will, making sure Charlie would be taken care of. Sarah had agreed to take him, though Margaret worried about how he would adjust to living across the country with people he barely knew. Margaret also made arrangements with a local hospice organization. The nurse, a kind woman named Linda, would visit twice a week to check on Margaret's condition and help manage her medications. Charlie was suspicious of Linda at first, staying close to Margaret during the visits, but he gradually accepted her presence. "He's very protective of you," Linda observed during her third visit. "Dogs often become more attentive when their owners are seriously ill. It's like they're trying to guard them from whatever they sense is wrong." Margaret's condition began to decline more noticeably as summer turned to fall. She tired more easily and had to stop their morning walks when even short distances became too much. But Charlie adapted to every change without complaint. When Margaret could no longer walk far, Charlie seemed content to sit with her in the backyard, watching birds and enjoying the fresh air. The bond between them deepened during these quieter days. Margaret would read aloud to Charlie for hours, and he would listen attentively, occasionally tilting his head as if considering her words. When Margaret napped during the day, which she was doing more frequently, Charlie would curl up beside her chair, one ear always alert for signs that she needed something. Margaret's neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, became a regular visitor, helping with grocery shopping and small household tasks. She was amazed by Charlie's behavior during Margaret's illness. "I've never seen a dog so in tune with a person," she told Margaret one afternoon. "It's like he knows exactly what you need before you even know it yourself." It was true. Charlie seemed to anticipate Margaret's needs in almost supernatural ways. He would bring her water when she was thirsty, alert her when she had been sitting in one position too long, and somehow always knew when she was feeling particularly sad or frightened. One evening in October, Margaret had a particularly bad episode. She woke up in the middle of the night struggling to breathe, her heart racing irregularly. Charlie, who had been sleeping on the floor beside her bed, immediately jumped up and began barking, something he rarely did indoors. When Margaret couldn't catch her breath to call for help, Charlie ran to the phone and continued barking until Mrs. Patterson, who had been given a key for emergencies, came to check on them. "Charlie saved your life tonight," the paramedic told Margaret as they prepared to take her to the hospital. "If he hadn't alerted your neighbor, you might not have made it." Margaret spent 3 days in the hospital, and when she returned home, she was noticeably weaker. Charlie seemed to understand that something fundamental had changed. He became even more gentle with her, moving slowly and carefully around the house as if he was afraid he might accidentally hurt her. Dr. Martinez visited Margaret at home the following week. After examining her, he pulled Linda aside for a quiet conversation that Margaret couldn't hear, but understood anyway. Charlie sat beside Margaret's chair during the entire visit, his eyes moving between her face and the doctor's, as if he was trying to understand what was being discussed. That night, as Margaret settled into bed with Charlie lying on the floor beside her, she made a decision. She was going to stop focusing on dying and start focusing on living whatever time she had left. She and Charlie were going to make the most of every day they had together, no matter how many or how few that might be. "We're not giving up yet, are we, boy?" she whispered to Charlie in the darkness. She heard his tail thump softly against the floor in response, and she knew that no matter what came next, they would face it together. Margaret woke up on a crisp November morning with an unusual sense of determination. Despite feeling weaker each day, she had decided that she and Charlie were going to make the most of whatever time they had left together. She wasn't going to spend her remaining days sitting around waiting to die. "Good morning, my beautiful boy," she said to Charlie, who was already awake and watching her with his gentle brown eyes. "What do you say we have some adventures today?" Charlie's tail wagged enthusiastically, as if he understood that something special was planned. Margaret had been thinking about all the things she wanted to do with Charlie, all the places in their small town they had never explored together. After breakfast, Margaret carefully bundled up in her warmest coat and loaded Charlie into the car. Their first stop was the old downtown district, where she and Robert used to walk when they were young. The sidewalks were lined with beautiful old oak trees, their leaves now brilliant shades of orange and gold. Charlie seemed to understand that this walk was different from their usual routes. He stayed close beside Margaret, matching her slower pace perfectly. When she needed to stop and rest on a bench, Charlie would sit patiently beside her, people watching with the same contentment she felt. "Look at that." "Charlie," Margaret said, pointing to a young couple walking hand in hand across the street. "That used to be your Grandpa Robert and me, 50 years ago." Charlie tilted his head, listening to her voice, and Margaret could swear he understood the importance of what she was sharing with him. They visited the small park where Margaret and Robert had gotten engaged. The pond was covered with fallen leaves, and ducks paddled peacefully across the water. Charlie was fascinated by the ducks but stayed calm and well-behaved, seeming to sense that this was a special place for Margaret. "Robert proposed right over there," Margaret told Charlie, pointing to a small gazebo by the water's edge. "I said yes, and we sat on that bench planning our whole future together." She felt tears in her eyes, but they were happy tears, full of good memories rather than sadness. Over the next few weeks, Margaret and Charlie embarked on a series of small adventures. They visited the library where Margaret had volunteered, and all her friends there were delighted to see Charlie again. The children's reading group insisted that Charlie listen to them read stories, just like old times. They drove to the nearby lake, where Margaret used to take her children when they were small. Charlie loved the water and waded in carefully while Margaret sat on a blanket watching him play. The simple joy on his face as he splashed in the shallow water made Margaret laugh out loud for the first time in weeks. Margaret also made sure to capture these moments. She asked Mrs. Patterson to take dozens of photos of her and Charlie together. She wanted her children to have pictures of Charlie's happy life with her, proof that he had been loved and cared for. "He's such a special dog," Mrs. Patterson said one afternoon, as she snapped pictures of Margaret and Charlie sitting together in the garden. "Look how he poses for the camera. It's like he knows these pictures are important." Charlie did seem to understand. He would sit perfectly still whenever Margaret or Mrs. Patterson pointed a camera at them, always positioning himself close enough to Margaret that they would both be in the frame. Margaret also began writing letters to her children, telling them stories about Charlie that she wanted them to remember. She wrote about the day she found him behind the garbage cans, about how he had learned to comfort her when she missed Robert, about all the ways he had made her life better. But most importantly, she wrote detailed instructions about Charlie's care. She documented his favorite foods, his daily routine, the games he liked to play, and the things that frightened him. She wanted whoever took care of Charlie after she was gone to understand him as well as she did. "Charlie loves to have his ears scratched, but not too rough," she wrote. "He's afraid of thunderstorms and needs to be held during them. He knows the words treat, walk, car ride, and bath, so spell them out if you don't want him to get excited. He sleeps on the floor beside the bed, never on it, but he likes to have a soft blanket." Margaret's condition continued to worsen, but she was determined not to let it stop their adventures. When walking became too difficult, Mrs. Patterson would drive them to different locations where Margaret could sit comfortably while Charlie explored. They visited a pumpkin patch where Charlie delighted in sniffing all the different scents. They went to a pet store where the employees made a fuss over Charlie and gave him treats. One particularly meaningful trip was to the veterinary office where Margaret had first taken Charlie as a puppy. Dr. Hayes, now in his 60s, remembered them both well. "Look how handsome he's grown," Dr. Hayes said, examining Charlie gently, "and he's clearly been very well cared for. You've given him a wonderful life, Margaret." "He's given me a wonderful life, too," Margaret replied, watching Charlie accept Dr. Hayes' attention with his usual good nature. "I just want to make sure he stays healthy and happy after I'm gone." Dr. Hayes assured Margaret that Charlie was in excellent health for a 4-year-old dog. "He could easily live another 8 to 10 years, the veterinarian said. "Maybe more. You've kept him in great shape." This news made Margaret both happy and sad. She was glad Charlie would have many good years ahead of him, but it also meant he would have to live most of his life without her. The thought of Charlie wondering where she had gone, waiting for her to come back, was almost unbearable. That evening, Margaret sat with Charlie in their favorite spot in the living room. She had been thinking about the future constantly lately, trying to figure out how to help Charlie understand what was going to happen. "I wish I could explain it to you," she said, stroking his soft fur. "I wish I could tell you that when I have to go away. It won't be because I don't love you anymore." Charlie looked up at her with those wise brown eyes, and Margaret had the strangest feeling that he already understood more than she realized. Dogs seem to have an instinct about these things, a way of knowing when their humans were preparing to leave them. Linda, the hospice nurse, had noticed Charlie's behavior too. "He's getting ready," she told Margaret during one of her visits. Dogs often become more clingy and protective when they sense their owner's time is getting short. "He's trying to take care of you while he still can." Margaret made one more important decision during those precious weeks. She wanted to plan her own funeral service, and she wanted to make sure Charlie could be there to say goodbye. She had heard of other people doing this, and while it was unusual, it felt right to her. "I want Charlie to understand what happened to me," she told her children during a family phone conference. "I don't want him to spend the rest of his life wondering where I went." Sarah was hesitant about the idea, but Michael understood. "If that's what you want, Mom, we'll make it happen. Charlie deserves to say goodbye, too." As November turned to December, Margaret felt her strength fading more quickly, but she also felt a sense of peace she hadn't expected. She and Charlie had made beautiful memories together during these final weeks. She had shown him how much she loved him, and she believed he understood that their bond would continue even after she was gone. "We've had a good run, haven't we, boy?" she whispered to Charlie one snowy evening as they sat together by the fireplace. Charlie's tail thumped softly against the floor, and Margaret knew that whatever came next, they had made the most of their time together. December arrived with a heavy snowfall that blanketed Margaret's neighborhood in pristine white. She watched from her bedroom window as Charlie played in the backyard, his golden fur bright against the snow. Even in her weakened state, seeing his joy made her smile. But she knew her time was running out. Margaret could no longer hide how sick she was becoming. Getting out of bed required tremendous effort, and even simple tasks like brushing her teeth left her exhausted. Linda, the hospice nurse, was now visiting daily instead of twice a week. The medications were helping with the pain, but they also made Margaret feel foggy and disconnected from the world around her. Charlie had adapted to every change in Margaret's condition, but his behavior was becoming increasingly protective. He rarely left her bedside now, lying on his favorite blanket beside her bed and watching her with constant vigilance. When Margaret slept, which she was doing more frequently, Charlie would rest his head on his paws but keep his eyes open, alert to any sound or movement. "He knows," Linda told Mrs. Patterson during one of her visits. "Dogs can sense when death is approaching. Charlie is trying to guard Margaret like he's protecting her from something he can't see but knows is coming." Margaret's children had both arrived the week before. Sarah flew in from California, and Michael drove up from Texas with his wife and teenage daughter. The house felt full and alive again, but Margaret could see the worry in their eyes every time they looked at her. Charlie was initially confused by all the new people in the house. He had met Margaret's family before, but not when Margaret was so sick and vulnerable. He stayed close to her bed, occasionally going downstairs to greet the visitors but always returning quickly to his post beside Margaret. "He's like a little guardian angel," Margaret's granddaughter Emma said. She was 16 and had always loved animals, but she had never seen a dog so devoted to one person. "It's like he's trying to keep Grandma safe." Margaret appreciated having her family close, but she also felt the weight of their grief. They were all trying to be strong for her, but she could see how hard it was for them to watch her decline. Charlie, on the other hand, seemed to accept her condition without the complicated emotions that humans brought to death and dying. "Charlie doesn't feel sorry for me," Margaret told Sarah one afternoon as they watched the dog sleep peacefully beside the bed. "He just loves me exactly as I am right now." There's something beautiful about that kind of acceptance. Dr. Martinez made house calls now, checking on Margaret's condition and adjusting her medications as needed. During his visit on a snowy Tuesday morning, he sat down beside Margaret's bed with the serious expression she had learned to recognize. "Margaret, I think we're looking at days rather than weeks now," he said gently. "Your heart is working very hard, and I can see you're in more discomfort. We can increase the pain medication to keep you more comfortable." Margaret nodded, feeling a strange sense of relief. The uncertainty had been almost as difficult as the illness itself. Now she knew she could focus on saying goodbye properly. "I want to stay here," she said firmly. "In my own bed, with Charlie beside me." "Of course," Dr. Martinez replied. "Linda, we'll make sure you have everything you need to be comfortable." That afternoon, Margaret asked her family to gather around her bed. Charlie seemed to sense the importance of the moment and positioned himself where he could see everyone while staying close to Margaret. "I want to tell you all how grateful I am," Margaret began, her voice weaker than usual but determined. "Having you here with me, knowing that Charlie will be loved and cared for, it means everything to me." She looked at each of her family members, then down at Charlie, who was watching her intently with his brown eyes. "And Charlie, my sweet boy, you have been the best companion an old woman could ask for. You taught me that it's never too late to love someone new." Charlie's tail thumped softly against the floor, as if he understood that this was an important conversation. Margaret reached down to stroke his head, marveling at how soft his fur still felt under her fingers. Over the next few days, Margaret drifted in and out of consciousness more frequently. When she was awake, Charlie was always there, sometimes resting his head gently on the bed beside her hand. When visitors came to say goodbye, Charlie would watch them carefully as if evaluating whether they were upsetting Margaret. Mrs. Patterson brought Margaret's favorite flowers from her greenhouse. The church pastor came to pray with the family. Old friends from the library stopped by to share memories and express their love. Through it all, Charlie maintained his quiet vigil. On Thursday morning, Margaret woke feeling different. The pain was less, but she also felt like she was floating somehow, disconnected from her body. Linda explained that this was normal, that her body was beginning the process of letting go. "How long?" Sarah asked quietly. "Probably today," Linda replied. "Maybe tomorrow, but soon." Margaret spent that day saying individual goodbyes to each family member. She gave Sarah her grandmother's jewelry and asked Michael to take care of her garden in the spring. She told Emma to always remember that she was loved and capable of doing anything she set her mind to. But her longest conversation was with Charlie. In the afternoon, when the house was quiet and her family was resting, Margaret struggled to sit up in bed. Charlie immediately stood and moved closer, concerned by her effort. "Come here, sweet boy," Margaret whispered, patting the bed beside her. For the first time in weeks, Charlie carefully climbed up and lay down next to her, being incredibly gentle not to jostle her. Margaret wrapped her arm around Charlie's warm body, feeling his steady breathing against her side. "I need you to understand something," she said softly. "I'm going to have to go away, and I won't be able to come back. But that doesn't mean I'm leaving you because I want to." Charlie looked up at her with those intelligent brown eyes, and Margaret could swear he was listening to every word. "Sarah is going to take good care of you. She has a big yard and 2 children who will love you very much. It will be different, but it will be good." She continued talking to Charlie for nearly an hour, telling him about all the joy he had brought to her life, how he had helped her through the loneliness after Robert died, how proud she was of the wonderful dog he had become. Charlie lay, perfectly still, occasionally licking her hand gently as if he was trying to comfort her. "The most important thing I want you to remember," Margaret said, her voice growing even softer, "is that love doesn't end just because someone goes away. I will always love you, Charlie, even when you can't see me anymore." As evening approached, Margaret's breathing became more labored. Her family gathered around the bed, and Charlie took his usual position on the floor beside her, though he kept one paw touching the bed frame as if maintaining a connection to her. Margaret looked around at all the faces she loved most in the world. Her children holding her hands, her granddaughter sitting quietly in the corner, Mrs. Patterson standing in the doorway with tears in her eyes, and Charlie watching over all of them with the dignity and grace he had always shown. "Thank you," Margaret whispered, though it was unclear if she was speaking to her family, to Charlie, or to life itself for giving her so many years of love and happiness. As the sun set outside her bedroom window, casting long shadows across the room, Margaret closed her eyes and let herself drift away. Charlie seemed to sense the exact moment when she stopped breathing. He lifted his head, looked at her face, for a long moment, then let out a soft whimper that broke everyone's heart. The house fell silent except for the quiet sounds of crying from Margaret's family. Charlie remained perfectly still beside the bed, as if he was standing guard over Margaret one final time. Even in their grief, Margaret's family was amazed by Charlie's behavior. He wasn't frantically trying to wake her or showing distress. Instead, he seemed to be saying his own quiet goodbye. Linda arrived an hour later to help with the arrangements that needed to be made. As she worked, Charlie never left Margaret's side. When the funeral home staff arrived to take Margaret's body, Charlie watched solemnly but didn't try to interfere. It was as if he understood that this was part of the process Margaret had tried to explain to him. That night, Sarah tried to coax Charlie to come downstairs for dinner, but he refused to leave Margaret's empty bedroom. He lay on his blanket beside the bed, looking up at the spot where Margaret had been just hours before. The family decided to let him stay there, understanding that Charlie needed to process Margaret's death in his own way. Margaret was gone, but her influence on Charlie's behavior was still evident. Even in his grief, he remained the well-mannered, gentle dog she had raised him to be. He seemed to understand that the family was hurting too, and he accepted their tears and embraces with the same patience he had always shown Margaret. The next morning, as the family began making funeral arrangements, Charlie finally came downstairs. He ate a little food and went outside briefly, but he spent most of the day lying in Margaret's favorite chair, as if he was waiting for her to come back and join him there. Sarah sat beside him that evening, gently stroking his fur. "She loved you so much, Charlie," she said through her tears. "And you made her so happy. I promise we'll take good care of you." Charlie looked at Sarah with his gentle brown eyes, and for the first time since Margaret died, his tail wagged slightly. It was a small sign, but it gave the family hope that Charlie would eventually be okay, even though his heart was broken just like theirs. The morning of Margaret's funeral arrived gray and cold, with a light snow falling steadily outside. Charlie had spent the previous 3 days in a state of quiet confusion, moving between Margaret's empty bedroom and her favorite chair downstairs, as if he couldn't quite accept that she wasn't coming back. Sarah had been watching Charlie carefully, worried about how he was handling Margaret's death. He was eating very little and seemed to have lost the spark that had always made him such a joyful dog. The veterinarian had warned them that dogs could experience genuine grief, and Charlie was clearly struggling. "Are you sure about bringing him to the funeral?" Michael asked Sarah as they prepared to leave for the church. "It might be too upsetting for him." Sarah looked at Charlie, who was sitting by the front door with his leash in his mouth, somehow understanding that something important was happening. "Mom specifically wanted him there," she said. She thought it would help him understand what happened to her. The family had explained the situation to Reverend Phillips, who had known Margaret for many years. Despite the unusual nature of the request, he had agreed to allow Charlie to attend the service. Margaret had been a beloved member of the congregation, and everyone knew how important Charlie was to her. When they arrived at the church, Charlie walked calmly beside Sarah, his behavior impeccable despite the unfamiliar surroundings. Many of Margaret's friends and neighbors had come to pay their respects, and several of them stopped to greet Charlie, remembering him from his visits to the library and around the neighborhood. "That dog was Margaret's whole world," Mrs. Patterson said to another neighbor as they watched Charlie enter the church. "I don't know what he's going to do without her." Inside the church, Charlie lay quietly beside the front pew where Margaret's family was seated. He seemed to understand the solemnity of the occasion, remaining perfectly still as people spoke about Margaret's life and the love she had shared with everyone around her. But when the service concluded and people began filing past Margaret's casket to pay their final respects, something extraordinary happened. Charlie suddenly stood up and walked directly to the casket, as if he had been waiting for this moment. Sarah started to call him back, worried that he might be disruptive, but Reverend Phillips gently touched her arm. "Let him say goodbye," he said quietly. Charlie approached the casket slowly and deliberately. When he reached it, he sat down directly in front of it and simply stayed there, looking up at the polished wood that contained Margaret's body. The church fell completely silent as everyone watched this remarkable display of loyalty and grief. Minutes passed, but Charlie didn't move. He sat perfectly still, as if he was having his own private conversation with Margaret. Some of the mourners began to cry, moved by the sight of this devoted dog refusing to leave his beloved owner's side. "He knows she's in there," whispered one of Margaret's library friends. "Look at how he's sitting. He's saying goodbye." Finally, after what felt like an eternity but was probably only 5 minutes, Charlie slowly stood up. But instead of returning to Sarah, he did something that broke everyone's heart. He lay down directly beside the casket, resting his head on his paws, and closed his eyes. "Charlie, come here, boy," Sarah called softly, but Charlie didn't respond. He seemed determined to stay with Margaret for as long as possible. Reverend Phillips made the decision to continue with the service, working around Charlie's presence. As the pallbearers prepared to carry the casket out of the church, they had to gently coax Charlie to move. He did so reluctantly, but immediately positioned himself to follow the casket as it was carried outside. At the cemetery, the same scene repeated itself. As soon as the casket was positioned over the gravesite, Charlie took up his post beside it, lying down in the cold snow and refusing to move. The family tried to encourage him to sit with them during the brief graveside service, but Charlie seemed to have made up his mind about where he belonged. "He's not going to leave her," Michael said quietly to Sarah. "Look at him. He thinks if he stays there, she'll somehow come back." During the entire graveside service, Charlie remained motionless beside the casket. Even when the first shovelfuls of dirt were thrown onto it, Charlie didn't move. He lay there like a statue, his golden fur contrasting sharply with the dark wood and white snow. As the burial concluded and people began to leave, Charlie still refused to move. Sarah knelt down beside him, her own tears falling onto his fur as she tried to convince him to come with her. "Charlie, we have to go home now," she said gently. "Margaret would want you to come with us. She wouldn't want you to stay out here in the cold." But Charlie looked up at Sarah with eyes so filled with sadness that it took her breath away. It was clear that he didn't understand why everyone was leaving Margaret alone in this cold, lonely place. It took the combined efforts of Sarah, Michael, and 2 of Margaret's neighbors to finally convince Charlie to leave the cemetery. Even then, he looked back over his shoulder repeatedly as they led him to the car, as if he was hoping to see Margaret following behind them. The ride back to Margaret's house was heartbreaking. Charlie sat in the back seat staring out the window with an expression of profound sadness. He had always been such an expressive dog, with his tail wagging and his eyes bright with curiosity about the world around him. Now he seemed like a shadow of his former self. Back at the house, people gathered for a reception in Margaret's honor. There was food and conversation, stories shared about Margaret's life and the impact she had made on everyone who knew her. But Charlie wasn't interested in any of it. He went straight upstairs to Margaret's bedroom and lay down on his blanket beside her empty bed. Sarah found him there an hour later, still staring at the spot where Margaret's bed used to be. The family had already moved most of Margaret's furniture in preparation for selling the house, but they had left Charlie's blanket and some of Margaret's belongings to help him during the transition. "Oh, Charlie," Sarah said, sitting down on the floor beside him. "I know how much you miss her. We all do." Charlie looked at Sarah with those expressive brown eyes, and for a moment she could swear she saw him asking a question. Why did she leave me? When is she coming back? That night, Charlie refused to eat dinner. Sarah tried tempting him with treats and even some table scraps, things that would normally make him excited, but he showed no interest in food. He seemed to be waiting for Margaret to come and feed him herself. Dr. Hayes, Margaret's veterinarian, stopped by the next morning to check on Charlie. He examined the dog gently while explaining to Sarah what they might expect in the coming days and weeks. Dogs grieve just like humans do, Dr. Hayes said. Charlie had an unusually strong bond with Margaret, so his grief is likely to be particularly intense. Some dogs stop eating, some become lethargic, and some develop anxiety when separated from anything that reminds them of their deceased owner. How long does it usually last? Sarah asked, worried about Charlie's refusal to eat. It varies, Dr. Hayes replied. Some dogs adjust within a few weeks, others take months. The key is to be patient and try to establish new routines while still acknowledging his grief. Over the next few days, Charlie's behavior became even more concerning. He would spend hours sitting by the front door, as if waiting for Margaret to come home. When cars drove by the house, he would lift his head hopefully, then sink back down when he realized it wasn't her. He also began carrying around one of Margaret's slippers, something he had never done before. He would pick it up gently in his mouth and carry it with him from room to room, finally settling down with it between his paws when he rested. It still smells like her, Linda, the hospice nurse, explained when she stopped by to check on the family. He's holding on to anything that connects him to Margaret. It's actually quite common in grieving dogs. Sarah tried everything she could think of to help Charlie through his grief, but nothing seemed to work. She took him for walks in Margaret's neighborhood, hoping the familiar sights and smells would comfort him, but Charlie just walked listlessly beside her, showing none of his usual interest in exploring. She brought him his favorite toys, but he ignored them. She tried playing music, remembering that Margaret used to read aloud to Charlie in the evenings, but he showed no response to that either. The most heartbreaking moment came a week after the funeral. Sarah was packing up some of Margaret's clothes when she heard Charlie whimpering downstairs. She found him in the living room, sitting in front of Margaret's favorite chair and crying softly, a sound she had never heard from him before. He's calling for her, Sarah realized, her own tears starting again. He's calling for Margaret to come back. That night, as Sarah lay in the guest bedroom, she could hear Charlie moving restlessly throughout the house. He seemed to be searching every room, looking for Margaret in all her favorite places. The sound of his paws on the hardwood floors and his occasional soft whimpers created a symphony of grief that broke Sarah's heart all over again. Sarah knew she would be taking Charlie back to California with her in a few days, but she wondered if he would ever recover from losing the person who had meant everything to him. Margaret had been right when she said that love doesn't end when someone goes away, but Sarah was beginning to understand that sometimes love could be almost too painful to bear. 2 weeks had passed since Margaret's funeral, and Charlie's grief seemed to be deepening rather than improving. Sarah had delayed her return to California twice, worried about taking Charlie away from the only home he had ever known while he was still so fragile. She watched him constantly, hoping to see some sign that he was beginning to heal. The breakthrough came on a Tuesday morning in late December. Sarah was in Margaret's kitchen packing the last of the dishes when she heard Charlie barking outside. It wasn't his usual alert bark when someone approached the house. This bark sounded different, almost excited. Sarah rushed to the window and saw Charlie in the backyard, playing with something in the snow. As she watched, she realized he was chasing a red cardinal that had landed near Margaret's bird feeder. The bird would fly a few feet away and Charlie would bound after it playfully, his tail wagging for the first time since Margaret died. Margaret always said cardinals were special, Mrs. Patterson said, appearing at the back door with a cup of coffee. She had been coming over daily to help Sarah with the house and to check on Charlie. She believed they were messages from people who had passed away. Sarah watched Charlie continue his gentle game with the cardinal, and for the first time in weeks she saw glimpses of the joyful dog Margaret had always described. The bird seemed completely unafraid of Charlie, even landing on the ground just a few feet away from him before flying to a low branch. "It's like the bird is teasing him," Sarah said, smiling despite herself. "Look how gently Charlie is playing. He's not trying to catch it, just following it around." The cardinal stayed in the yard for nearly an hour, and Charlie remained engaged the entire time. When the bird finally flew away, Charlie sat down in the snow and looked up at the sky, his tail still wagging slightly. That afternoon, Charlie ate a full meal for the first time since Margaret's death. He also showed interest in going for a walk, though he still moved more slowly than he used to. Sarah decided to take him to the cemetery, wondering if visiting Margaret's grave might help him understand what had happened. The cemetery was quiet and peaceful, covered in a fresh layer of snow. Charlie seemed to know exactly where they were going, leading Sarah directly to Margaret's gravesite. When they reached the headstone, Charlie's behavior was remarkable. Instead of lying down and refusing to move like he had at the funeral, Charlie sat beside the grave and looked around alertly. After a few minutes, he stood up and began sniffing around the area, as if he was exploring rather than grieving. "It's okay, boy," Sarah said softly. "She's resting here now. She's not in pain anymore." Charlie looked up at Sarah, and for the first time since Margaret died, he approached her and gently placed his head against her leg. It was a small gesture, but it felt like a breakthrough. Charlie was finally accepting comfort from someone other than Margaret. They stayed at the cemetery for about 30 minutes. When it was time to leave, Charlie followed Sarah without resistance. He even looked back at the gravesite just once, not with the desperate longing he had shown before, but with something that looked almost like peaceful acceptance. That evening, Sarah made a decision. She called her husband in California and told him she was bringing Charlie home after New Year's. "I think he's ready," she said. "He's still sad, but he's starting to heal." Margaret was right about him being resilient. Over the next few days, Sarah began preparing Charlie for the big transition. She introduced him to his travel crate, making it comfortable with his favorite blanket and one of Margaret's old sweaters that still smelled like her. Charlie investigated the crate curiously, but didn't seem stressed by it. Sarah also started a new routine with Charlie, taking him for walks at different times of day and feeding him at slightly different hours. She wanted to break him out of the exact schedule he had maintained with Margaret, helping him adapt to the idea that life could be different but still good. The red cardinal continued to visit the backyard every day, and Charlie always perked up when he saw it. Sarah began to understand what Margaret had meant about cardinals being special, whether it was coincidence or something more. The bird's presence seemed to comfort Charlie in a way that nothing else could. On New Year's Eve, Sarah decided to have one last evening in Margaret's house before they left for California. She built a fire in the fireplace and sat in Margaret's favorite chair with Charlie beside her, just like Margaret used to do. "Your mom loved you so much," Sarah said to Charlie, stroking his soft fur. "She told me all about how you saved each other. She wanted me to make sure you knew that leaving you was the hardest thing she ever had to do." Charlie looked up at Sarah with those expressive brown eyes, and she could see intelligence and understanding there. Dogs might not understand death the way humans do, but Charlie clearly understood love, loyalty, and loss. "She also told me that you're strong and brave," Sarah continued. "She said you would be okay because you have so much love to give." And she was right. "My kids are going to adore you, Charlie. You're going to have a good life with us." The next morning, Sarah loaded Charlie and his belongings into her rental car for the drive to California. She had decided against flying, thinking the long car ride would give Charlie time to adjust gradually to being away from his old home. Charlie seemed to understand that this was a permanent departure. He looked back at Margaret's house as they drove away, but he didn't whine or try to get out of the car. He settled down in the back seat with Margaret's old sweater and watched the familiar landscape pass by the windows. The 3-day drive across the country was surprisingly peaceful. Charlie traveled well, eating his meals and walking calmly at rest stops. Sarah talked to him constantly during the drive, telling him about her family and what his new life would be like. "Margaret showed me all the pictures she took of you," Sarah said as they drove through the desert of New Mexico. "She wanted me to know everything about you. She said you love to play fetch, but you're afraid of thunderstorms. She said you're gentle with children, and you like to help in the garden." When they finally arrived at Sarah's house in a suburb of San Diego, Charlie's adventure began anew. Sarah's children, 10-year-old Emma and 8-year-old Jack, had been eagerly waiting to meet their grandmother's famous dog. "He's beautiful," Emma said softly as Charlie cautiously explored the backyard. "But he looks sad." "He is sad," Sarah explained. "He misses Grandma Margaret very much. We need to be patient with him and show him lots of love." Charlie's adjustment to his new home was gradual but steady. The first few nights he slept on the floor beside Sarah's bed, just as he had with Margaret. But gradually, he began exploring the house and getting to know his new family. Jack, who had been hoping for a dog for years, was gentle and patient with Charlie. Instead of trying to force the dog to play, he would sit quietly nearby reading or doing homework, until Charlie felt comfortable enough to approach him. Emma discovered that Charlie loved to be brushed, something Margaret had mentioned in her letters. Every evening, Emma would sit with Charlie in the living room and brush his coat while telling him about her day at school. The most remarkable moment came 3 weeks after Charlie arrived in California. Sarah was working in her garden when she heard Jack laughing in the backyard. She looked up to see Charlie playing fetch with a tennis ball, his tail wagging with genuine enthusiasm for the first time since Margaret died. "He brought me the ball," Jack said excitedly. "I threw it and he actually brought it back. He wants to play." Sarah felt tears in her eyes as she watched Charlie run around the yard with Jack. Margaret had been right. Charlie was strong and resilient, and he did have more love to give. He would always miss Margaret, but he was learning to be happy again. That evening, Sarah sat down to write a letter she had been thinking about for weeks. It was addressed to Margaret, even though she knew Margaret would never read it. "Dear Mom," she wrote, "Charlie is going to be okay. It took time, but he's starting to heal. He's discovered that our backyard has squirrels, which is apparently very exciting. Emma brushes him every night, and Jack taught him to play fetch. He still carries your old sweater around sometimes, but he's making new memories too. You were right about love not ending when someone goes away. Charlie's love for you is still there, as strong as ever, but now he's sharing that love with us too. He's teaching my children about loyalty and devotion, and how to be gentle with something precious. Thank you for raising such a wonderful dog, and thank you for teaching him how to love so deeply. Even though your time together was shorter than it should have been, you gave him the foundation he needed to build a new life. Charlie is home now, Mom. Different from the home you gave him, but home nonetheless. And everywhere he goes, he carries your love with him." As Sarah finished the letter, she looked out the window and saw Charlie lying peacefully in a patch of sunlight in the backyard. His grief had not disappeared, but it had transformed into something more manageable. A quiet, permanent love for the woman who had saved him, and the understanding that love once given never truly ends. In the months that followed, Charlie would continue to heal and grow. He would learn to love Sarah's family while never forgetting Margaret. And sometimes, when the afternoon light hit the garden just right, Sarah would see Charlie pause in his playing and look up at the sky, his tail wagging slightly, as if he was saying hello to an old friend who was never really gone.